Vayamos haciendo un lar, tu color y mi color, tu color y mi color. Vayamos haciendo un lar.
Vayamos haciendo un lado tu color y mi color, tu color y mi color. Vayamos haciendo un lado.
Ya no tenemos razón para ignorar el amor, para ignorar el amor. Es tiempo de reflexión.
And I'm going to ask you to join me, and with a round of applause, we'll give a little Zoom round of applause and welcome our two guests. Our two guests today are Karen Cebreros and Elisa Sabatini. And many of you know Elisa, President and CEO of 𝐕A International, also of Los Niños de Baja California. So I'm going to start with Karen Cebreros. And Karen is, I've gotten to know Karen through my engagement here at 𝐕A International, and have especially gotten to know her because she is our coffee consultant, as we've made available some organic coffee on our 𝐕A Cafe platform. Karen has been indispensable in getting us connected actually on both sides of the border, both to coffee growers in Mexico and other parts, and also to coffee distributor here in San Diego, with whom we're collaborating as we make this organic, certified organic coffee available through our 𝐕A Cafe platform. So Karen, I want to bid you a very warm welcome and say thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to just ask you to share us a little bit about yourself by asking you to tell me what's happening lately in your life. ¿Qué hay de nuevo? What are you working on? What's keeping you busy these days?
Thank you for the invitation to be with you all today. It's an honor. And what's happening with us is what I've been working on since 2012, and it's microfinance.
Yes.
And I've spent the last 30 years in specialty coffee. I'm one of the founders of Certified Organic Coffee, and actually the first licensee in coffee in North America for fair trade. So as much as I love coffee, it's really a tool to use to generate education and take action to help impoverished farmers. And I've spent the last few years working in Guatemala, Mexico, Salvador, Honduras, Colombia, opening up microcredit for low-income women using basically the 𝐂𝐿𝐵 model, but I'm going to do my commercial.
Yeah.
We've also written a project of our own financial literacy that we want to launch globally through the International Women's Coffee Alliance. But what's happening, and why I'm thrilled to be with you today, is we're going to collaborate with 𝐕A International, who I've admired for decades, the work you do with microfinance. You are the leader, I don't know, maybe in the entire Western United States. It's impressive what you've done in Mexico and Guatemala. So having said that, we'll be opening our first microfinance program in Rosarito, La Misión. It's going to be in the area between Rosarito and Ensenada. And to help do that, I opened up a small, very micro, or maybe even nano coffee roasting business called Vida Nova, named after my two granddaughters. And our brand happens to be called Cup of Jill instead of Cup of Joe. And of course, Jill was my mother's name. So
Gotcha. It's a
this
family.
is my family event. Well, my CPA said, face it, you're doing a hobby now. I'm not making a fortune, but everything you buy at Vida Nova in Baja, a percentage goes to the microfinance program. So we're excited about that.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk more with Elisa because you two are thick as thieves in this microcredit venture. But tell me about the Vida Nova. Is that a storefront as well as is that a place people can stop in at, or that you hope people will stop in at least after
Yes.
COVID?
Absolutely, yes. We've been trying. We had this dream of opening our small little retail operation. It's on the free road at kilometer 40.
Okay.
I live in a ranch called Rancho Santini. In fact, interesting side note, Aldo Santini's father is the creator of the Caesar salad, and you can see the Santini room at Caesar's restaurant in Tijuana. So in any event, I live at Santini Ranch, and he happens to have a little strip mall on the property with plenty of parking and gated, very safe. So we opened 600 square feet. We have a 1 pound roaster, so it's very handcrafted, custom, fresh. We'll roast to your particular needs. You can pick an origin and then tell us how you'd like it roasted. light,
Yeah.
medium, dark, extra dark. So yes, we have a nice place. You can come in. We have wonderful chefs that were laid off from Sanofi. So they're organic chefs. So we're trying to bring in as much certified organic product as we can.
That's wonderful. And that's, so again, that's Vida Nova Coffee at kilometer 40 outside of Rosarito. Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
We love
Well,
to have you. We're open Wednesday through Sunday. We do a fantastic brunch and lunch. And we'll talk more in a minute about the big event coming Thursday, but we'll be there with coffee and great food, vegan, vegetarian, chicken, salads, you name it.
great. Well, and we'll make sure that that link and the invitation gets out to this crowd who are all border enthusiasts. This network that's been joining us on Tuesday are all one side or the other of the border, but they're fronterizos, borderlanders, and so we'll make sure that they get. And thanks again for joining us, Karen. I'm looking forward to picking up that train of conversation about microcredit as we bring Elisa in. So, Elisa, let me invite you again. Elisa Sabatini, most of you know her through Via International. I won't bother you with a long history of her recounting of her resume, but she worked for years. Elisa, how many years in Latin America before you came to the borderlands and really got in thick with Los Niños and Via International? Oops, your microphone.
I've been roaming around Mexico for a very long time. So, since the mid 80s, actually a signature event for me was the big earthquake in Mexico City in 1985,
Right.
where I was part of some of the relief efforts of that. And, you know, since then have found my way to doing community work and have spent the last 22 working with Los Niños and Via, you know, in the borders. So,
well, good. Well, as we get it, I want to ask you more on both of you about this experience of going to Mexico for the first time. But let me also ask you, Elisa, the 𝐂𝐈 de nuevo question, just to get a sense of your current engagements. What's keeping you busy these days?
well, the thing that is so, in a way, extraordinary for me has been that given the crisis situation, I mean, we as an organization have been encouraged by the communities to support with food security programs.
Yeah.
And I've actually kind of philosophically, the work that I initially did in Mexico had a lot to do with food and a lot to do with food distributions and large scale ones in 17 different states across Mexico. But it sort of feels like full circle. Now we're distributing food in Tijuana and in Logan and you know, trying to put together programs that are relevant to the communities right now. And so that's been my sort of thing. I mean, now I'm like looking at the content of our food packages and and you know, trying to figure out how long we can keep those things going, because it's a precarious time too.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and as I've learned since joining the Via International team, Via and Los Niños at one time really were, as you said, focused on food security and material assistance, and moved away from that toward this more integrated model of community development. But yeah, you're saying, as we've been discussing this crisis time, people the community leaders are telling us that food is a real issue, and yeah, so that tell us, Elisa, briefly just on the Los Niños side, the Mexican side, how has that food security and how have these food dispensas gotten out to the communities? What's been the method by which these needs are being met in Baja California?
Yeah, I mean, it's a critical question. I think, first of all, that the Los Niños team is phenomenal, small, phenomenal group of people that kind of jump into action when they have the opportunity. And one of the signature pieces of our program is that we've developed leaders in the communities, which is our mission of working with, you know, local leaders. But we've developed a really cadre of local leaders and Spanish promotoras, the ones that are sort of our community agents of change. And of course, with this circumstance, they were the ones that raised their hands and said, yes, I can do distributions, you know, from their individual homes into the community. And they are very extremely sort of responsible in everything, have been doing all the work to collect the information that's required from the donors And I guess the most exciting on that end too is that shortly here, we're just waiting for a stream of funding to come in through our Via Migrante program that members here on the team, Robert Vivar, Aida is our coordinator, and Rigo Reyes are part of that team. We will be starting up with some nutrition and health education programs with migrant and deportee populations in the next weeks. So that's probably the most exciting thing that's happening.
So I've heard Rigoberto Reyes use the word el gancho for the hook. The food and nutrition is the hook that gets people involved, and then in many ways is a way that Via has and Los Niños have been able to introduce these more kind of slow cook models of community development, but beginning at the point of immediate need within the community, for instance, food. And that's what you're describing with the Via Migrante program, is that right?
Right, exactly. And in one particular case of the shelter where we've been distributing meals prepared by the microcredit participants, well, now they themselves, the residents of that shelter, will be in a nutrition education program that we anticipate may turn in a future moment into some kind of microcredit for them to be able to establish themselves in the city of Tijuana.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, good. Well, so we're going to circle back to that microcredit question, which again, I know is a great point of collaboration between the two of you. But since I ended up getting you both in the room at the same time, I wanted to ask you both about your original decision to set up to reside in Mexico. I can't, if I had $1 for every time somebody said, oh, I'm going to move to Mexico someday, I'd be wealthy. But the number of people who actually follow through, gringos I'm talking, is very small. So what was it originally that led you each to choose to become a resident of Mexico? Was that a long thought out process or something that occurred spur of the moment? You decided to go for it? What led you to become a resident of Mexico?
Go ahead, Elisa.
Well, I've been roaming around Mexico for a very long time, but actually it was provoked for me mostly by work, because I really did want to be a legal person working in Mexico and not be sort of outside the legal realm of Mexican law. And so way back in the late 80s, I think, I started the legal process. And I guess one of the things unknown to many, I think, is the length of the process. So, you first have, these FM visas that have a duration of 5 years, and you have a series of those.
And what is FM, do you know? Does that stand for?
Something migratoria.
Yeah, yeah.
Something about migration, but
Right.
the process is I actually got the status pretty easily because of my work.
Gotcha.
And so essentially my initial visas were connected to my work status.
Gotcha.
And then it's such a long story, but at any rate, at some point the lawyer that was working on it lost all my paperwork, and that was like a very expensive and
this was back in the day when everything was by papers, right?
Yes, by paper. And the assertion was that his office was burglarized, but at any rate, sort of questionable things happening. And then I renewed the effort with our current lawyer for Los Niños, who does excellent work. And she's the one that just kept sort of insisting and doing all the paperwork correctly and everything for me to get that status. I actually lived in Mexico before I had the status. So, I currently, it looks like I'm on the Tijuana side here in my background photo, but I'm currently living in the United States on the San Diego side.
And so your status in Mexico is as a resident of Mexico, or are you a dual citizen, or what's the distinction there?
Yeah, I'm considered emigrada mexicana.
Yeah.
But that basically means if I went and resided for, I think, another series of time,
Yeah.
I could, then apply for a passport, and that would be a further, I would say the thing that I have is comparable to a green card in the
Gotcha.
United States.
Yeah.
And like friends of mine have said, yeah, well, you did the reverse thing. You know, it's kind of like the reverse. People are trying to get a green card up here and you're getting this.
Yeah.
At any rate, it's a very long process, pretty rigorous, very somewhat costly.
Yeah.
I think if you do it maybe yourself, it would be a little less than having the lawyer help you.
And
But it's not just that you go live in, you know, you don't just drive across the border and live in Mexico.
And you've told me that sometimes at the customs, people take a second glance because they're not used to seeing a lot of Norteamericanas who are inmigradas, who have that official. Yeah. Right.
And it does give you some benefits. The benefits I have include I can go free to museums like a Mexican resident to the national museums, and
Yeah.
then I can also you know, board planes and everything without filling out a bunch of paperwork, and because I'd be considered like a national.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
very good. Well, Karen, I know your story is very different, but tell us, how did Rosarito become your domicile?
It is very different. In 1964, my dad took a group of telephone company guys in little ski boats from Long Beach all the way to Cabo. Of course, there's no fuel, no marinas, no nothing all the way down, but it turned into the largest powerboat club in the Western US called Vagabundos del Mar. So he was going down there quite regularly. Then he built a park in Cabo, a trailer park. Well, he went the first summer, he drugged all of my brothers and sisters down, kicking and screaming because we wouldn't be with our summer friends.
Right.
We all fell in love with it and probably went back every summer to some part of Mexico for the rest of our lives. Sold a coffee company in 2008 and ended up purchasing a little place at Gaviotas. And then I wanted a job where I could travel. So I did spend 30 years on the road. Fortunately, it was a great ride all over the world. But when it came to settling down, my kids are here, my grandkids are here. So now I have the best of both worlds, clearly the best of both worlds.
And by here, you mean in Rosarito area?
I'm in Rosarito and they're in Otay Ranch.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah, right. So a regional, your regional family, yeah.
Yeah, it's terrific.
Yeah. Well, let me ask each of you to tell, just reflecting back on your getting settled. I know you both had extensive experience before, but what was the most surprising thing about really settling in Mexico, and what do you recall as being most surprising about as you really got, your roots sunk into Mexico? What would be the biggest surprise or contrast you draw from living in the United States?
Elisa?
Wow. That's a big question. A lot of things came into my mind. I think what I would say, I think about this very often, and I've thought about it during this particular period of time, even more so, is that the nature of my experience in Mexico was being very held. And I think the culture, the family connections, the acceptance of people in a sort of broad way. And most specifically, this is sort of emotional for me, is that I remember in periods of my life when I've had grief, when I lost my parents, I never felt comforted except by the people that I worked with in Mexico. Because they had a way of responding to grief that was just so different than my experience in the United States. And so I think maybe for many of us that have a love of Mexico and the culture and the people of Mexico, it has a lot to do with an emotional response to things that, the individualism and the nature of the United States is just very different.
So you use the language of being held. I hear in that the Spanish word abrazo, un abrazo, being held. Americans, maybe we think about being held and they feel like being held down or, somebody. Yeah. but yeah, is that what you meant by being held? You feel like you're being held in Mexico?
Mm-hmm. And there are a number of words that exist in Spanish in that kind of feeling sense that don't exist in English, or they don't have the same connotation in English.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's I like the fronteriza life, you know, of being able to be close to that culture. And
Yeah. Right. Good. Karen, what about you? What is it like to reside in Mexico? Does that feel different to you being
Oh,
rooted?
of course, yes, it feels different. It is different. I also had the opportunity to work off and on in Chiapas for 30 years, which you can't help but fall in love with the people and the whole lifestyle down there, the indigenous, the up across, talk about borders, going back and forth across Guatemala, Mexico was just a blessing. It was so much fun and interesting, but I married into a Mexican family. Cebreros is not my birth name. Sherman is.
Gotcha.
So you can see by my round face, Irish, English, German. But there's the Cebreroses and Mexican women and everybody I've met along the way. Beautiful, loving, talented, fun, great food. I mean, isn't Mexico and China the two biggest cuisines in the world? How can you go wrong? They just have a love of life.
Yeah.
It just grows on you. But I was lucky to be exposed young.
Right. So you got it growing up as a child, and then
Yeah.
through your marriage and your family, it really got more and more rooted over time in your business. Yeah. Your
Yeah.
work.
And my stepsister, she got married first, and she also married into a wonderful Mexican family.
Uh-huh.
So it just, and there's the extension of the family all over the world now is incredible.
Well, you've both alluded to it already, kind of by contrast. But what is it? How does the United States look different to you as you think of it? If think of yourself south looking north, you know, how do you see the United States from your? I'm thinking of your Norteamericanas, but with these deep roots in Mexico. How has that changed your? And maybe, you know, how does that change, or what? How does the United States look through your lenses? Desde afuera, desde el sur, from the southern point of view.
Messy.
Messy.
I'll put it in the words of my neighbor, Bobby, who owns Bobby by the Sea, a condominium restaurant complex. He said to me one day, probably about 10 years ago, he goes, when are you going to move here and quit driving back and forth? I was still working up here. When are you going to move down here? He goes, I'll tell you one thing that's true. If you move here, you'll add 10 years to your life.
Wow. Fascinating.
And the pace, you know, you have to adapt.
Yeah.
And it's just a different way of living, a different way of approaching things. And everybody's not as freaked out about every little thing as we are in the States.
Yeah, that kind of anxiety and stress.
When I cross the border, it diffuses. I say that for 30 years, I've felt that way.
You mean literally, like as you
as I drive across to Mexico, no matter what day, what year, what reason, I feel like I'm decompressing.
Yeah.
And I think that most of the 20,000 boomers that are flooding in can say the same thing.
Yeah, do you know a number, Karen, about, I heard a number in 2017 from our U.S. consulate in Tijuana, that at that time there were 350,000 U.S. citizens living in Baja California, of which he said the majority were U.S. citizens of Mexican ancestry. That is, they're part of these extended binational families. But that still meant that back then there were over 100,000, this is 2017,
Wow.
expats or some such. Have you heard a number? Do you know how many expats or gringos living in Baja there are?
No, but it's growing exponentially, the development, the building exponentially. I don't have a day that goes by where a couple doesn't drop in and say, we just sold our house in whatever, Montana, Florida, Canada. I mean, every day there's people coming.
Yeah, and you got your place in what year, Karen, the Rancho?
I originally purchased a small condo in Gaviotas in 2009.
Uh-huh.
So and then I started living there, more there than here, 3 years ago.
Gotcha, yeah. Well, then, Elisa, you alluded to the individualism of the United States already, but what else, how does the U.S. look through your Mexican lentes?
You know, I would share Karen's response about the pace of life and kind of the priorities of things. And then I also think that, you know, as I look, maybe this is a little broader frame, but to say, as I look at it from, I mean, I went through the whole process when NAFTA came into existence, and, you know, now there's this US whatever the new thing's called, USA, Canada, Mex, whatever,
Yeah.
deal that's being made. And I was taken aback, actually with a colleague of ours comment the other day, Dr. Gerber, who mentioned in a talk that, you know, regardless of what the policy is, the trade will continue.
Yeah.
And really, regardless of what this horrific political situation is in terms of lack of friendship between our neighbors, the friendships and the cross-border relationships will endure and they will continue because it's the human will that makes them interesting. And so I think in that kind of broader context, as I sort of would sit on the Mexican side, I would sort of shake my head and say, you crazy Americans, running around all stressed out and you know, all this striving, and there's not as much living happening. And so I think that that's probably this, Karen said she crosses the border and she feels calm. Well, you know, it's because actually the lifestyle is much more about living than striving.
Being. I've never lived in Mexico, but just from hanging out on the border and being so close with friends in Tijuana and spending time in Tijuana, that sense of, you know, and your comment, Elisa, about from the Mexican side, I have the sense that, you know, our lands are so integrated. Of course, California, and, you know, and I was in a conversation the other day and I referenced the US-Mexico war, and my conversation partner said, oh, ¿quieres decir la guerra de la intervención norteamericana? The war of North American intervention, which is what it would be called in Mexico. And from the Mexican perspective, of course, these lands are part of the land. I mean, this is all, and as opposed to this notion that the border somehow really defines the landscape and, you know, defines the relationships, defines the territory. Yeah, and this crazy idea that somehow we could just harden our way to, you know, cutting all that off. It just seems so preposterous, doesn't it? But unfortunately, I guess our government's very committed to that, right? And not just the current administration, but across several administrations, this idea of hardening the border, harden the border has been US policy for 30 years. It's baffling to me.
Well, and I think if you sort of extend your thinking to the history of things, and, you know, you think about the Treaty of Guadalupe, which was when they defined the borders, certainly. And I'm from the state of Colorado, and, you know, southern Colorado was all part of Mexico. And I've spent a lot of time on what are called those centennial farms there that have people that, you know, they've been there for generations on those farms. And that, I mean, essentially that culture, even the Spanish, you hear the Spanish in southern Colorado, and it sounds like it's out of, you know, Cervantes, or, you know, it's like out of the Spanish from Don Quixote, you know, because they've retained the nature of that culture. And given what's going on right now in our country to the north, and the maybe for some discontent with certain groups in our country, I mean, what is still sort of astonishes me is all of that history. I used to say to friends of mine from the East Coast, I said, you know, I really don't care all that much about George Washington. I care about the Navajo people. I care about the people where I live and where I'm, you know, and that history is just obliterated in our schools and in many respects. I mean, so I'm kind of excited about this new time we're in, where there's respect more for indigenous cultures. There's more respect for, hopefully, for other peoples and other heroes of our history.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Well, let me, before I want to get to microcredit, but just let's close out this loop of conversation so is this election season less stressful for you since you're, you know, seeing it from the Mexican side? I mean, it's such a crazy time. Do you feel you're able to, feel like you have some distance or perspective on all this? Karen used the word crazy about how the United States looks. How's this current political season and tempest that we're living through affecting you, or how are you hanging in there through all that?
Well, and I think Karen might be having a technical difficulty.
Yeah, it looks like we may have lost Karen, but carry on, Elisa. Any thoughts about that? Just how are you?
I mean, I guess what I would say is, you know, I'm coming from a family that was an immigrant family. I think that currently what's going on in the United States is just a travesty of who we are as people, and the, you know, the belief that we have to, you know, to embrace others and certainly embrace immigrants. I think that the current administration just has the wrong idea.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, the wrong-headedness of it all.
Yeah.
Karen, can you still hear us?
Actually, no. We're going to be COVID irresponsible here. Karen's at my house, so so I'm going to go and we'll both be on the same computer.
Okay.
But something happened with my other one.
What was the question? I didn't even hear it.
Oh, Karen, I was just asking how you're doing through the crazy politics of the moment. Do you feel like you're able to maintain a little distance on it, or is it driving you as crazy as it is everybody else?
Well, the modus operandi in Baja is don't bring it up.
Aha. Yeah. Yeah, just kind of, you don't talk about it because it's just invites too much mayhem, huh?
Yes, I mean, like anywhere, everybody has very strong sentiments and we're all living next door to each other. So in our community, we've just agreed, don't talk about politics. And I don't want to alienate anyone. I need people to come and drink coffee.
Yeah, understood. No, very familiar with that. Yeah, good. Well, let's move on to coffee. Karen, tell us about the 30 years. So you've seen a revolution in the way that people in North America think about coffee, and especially about coffee, whatever, free trade, organic coffee that is rooted in community. And you've been a big part of that. Is that, you mentioned you felt like your career has been a great ride. Tell us about that sweep and how do folks think of their coffee differently than they did 30 years ago?
Well, I was lucky to be part of the early specialty coffee movement. 30 years ago, I had at the second specialty coffee show. We're looking at the 30th right now, but had to cancel this year, of course. But someone asked me if the coffee I had found in Peru was organic. I didn't know what it meant. I did the research, and the company told me, well, if you get it certified organic, we'll buy some from you. A year and a half later, second mortgage on the house, ship it to the wrong coast, rail it across the US to San Francisco, call the guy, and the guy goes, great, I'll take 5 bags. And of course there were 250 bags, so my business was born. But in those days, there were only 30 roasters in America, in the United States of America. Today, there's probably over 100 just in San Diego. Wow. So that was a company called Allegro, which of course went on to be sold to Whole Foods, which is now owned by Bezos. That was my first client, but it was a great experience. So coffee is much like oil and guns and liquor. I mean, it throws off billions of dollars, but it needs to be used as a tool for good. And that's the way I saw it. The poverty is amazing. On the environmental side, coffee, tobacco, and cotton are responsible for 50% of the agricultural pollution on the planet. We can't eat chemicals, period. We have to stop. There's a clear connection between cancer and other illnesses and all the things we put into our body. We must have clean food and clean water. It's that simple. But then it became clear that it's also a giant issue for social justice. I gave some of the first tours to origin countries in the early 90s and had to wake people up. We called it a wall of shame. The importers and traders didn't want people to see the reality in the poverty. People were making between $1 and $5 a day, and I'm here to tell you they're still making between $1 and $5 a day, which led me to shift from business as usual and really focus on microfinance for women, because I've had the pleasure and opportunity to hear Elisa speak for decades, and I wanted to be her. So we got started, and through the generosity, I must plug Rotary. I cannot tell you how powerful our movement has been with the generosity of Rotary in every single country, along with personal donors and the coffee companies themselves.
Yeah.
We're just getting ready to send 100,000 to Honduras through San Diego Downtown Rotary's efforts.
Yeah. So you got to microcredit and community development through the coffee and
Yes.
experience and learning about producers of coffee and the circumstances, especially women. And are women, how do women, what's the gender in gap, or is there one in coffee production? Are men and women equally involved in coffee production in Mexico and Central America, or does it tend to be a male business or not?
That's a great question you ask, John. The labor side of it tends to be women, and most countries and most continents, whether you're talking about Asia, Africa, or Latin America, 70% of the work is done by the women. The men handle the money, perhaps some of the marketing. But the reason I got into it wasn't just for obvious reasons. It was the domestic violence issues.
Yeah.
And the women in Latin America said to the first group of women I took 17 people from North America, Canada, US, every type of business, from roasters to trainers, big companies. The only woman who at the time was 85 who owned her own company besides me. And I'd hired only women to start. But the women said in Spanish, we just want to do what you do. We want to be like you. We want to raise our children, send them to school, be healthy, and do business with dignity and stop the domestic violence. And that was it.
Yeah.
We got revved up, and today we have 29 countries in our network of women in coffee.
And then Elisa, for you, it was food security, food distribution, but you also ended up really focusing on women in community and the model of promotoria, which I know can include men and women, but most often women, promotoras. Is that a trajectory that also kind of you found parallel with Karen, that you kind of started in one place and then kept learning about the depths of the challenges facing women in Mexico and Central America?
Yeah, I think precisely so. I think that the food security work that I started out doing, which was, yes, essentially assistential kinds of work.
And say a word about that assistential for
I'm not sure that's English, assistencia, but you know, it's sort of like charitable work that is more maybe giveaway than a long-term connection with a community and you know, in a relief situation, which is kind of where I started with the earthquake in Mexico City, it's essential. That's what people need. People immediately needed food and water in Mexico City. But you know, over time, as I sort of saw that you sort of get more into the structural ideas. And I think in a sense, food, I mean, I started in many ways like Karen with agriculture and nutrition and production. And so a lot of it is those rural communities, and the situation for certainly women in those communities is often at a very, you know, precarious level. But I also think that one of the things that, to go kind of to our, at least thinking at VIA about integrated development, is that, you know, years and years ago in a community meeting in Guatemala, I remember these groups, and they were sort of arguing about how we should do something. And there were Ladinos who were kind of mixed race communities with indigenous people and Spanish and other, and then Mayans. And I remember this Mayan guy who stood up and said, the difference in the way we think is that you guys think in boxes. You think about that somehow agriculture isn't connected. You have like ministries of agriculture and ministries of tourism and ministries of nutrition and a ministry of this and that. And he said, but you don't see that they're all connected. They're all connected one to the other. And so for me, you know, microfinance is as much about that linkage between, you know, food needs, health needs, you know, and then basic economic need. That economics, in its pure sense, the Greek translation of it, means the management of a household.
Sure. Yeah.
So if you link them together more as an integrated whole, it's more about the whole well-being of a community or structure.
And then as you and Karen have both mentioned, the gender stuff comes in so powerfully, right? As women are the drivers of households,
Of
right?
households.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or whether, even as they're often disempowered, right? But nonetheless. So you
Right.
two have found each other through your common interests and ended up with microfinance and microcredit as a shared. You really are both big believers in that tool. Karen, you mentioned the Grameen model. Tell us, both of you, about how do you see what are the next steps for microcredit in Baja California? How are new models or emerging trends in microcredit in Baja California offering people hope?
We are getting ready to throw quite a wingding on Thursday in Baja with Elisa as our keynote speaker. We're collaborating with Rotary and Mujeres para Mujeres, a group that supports women, along with Rotary. Rotary's, the La Misión Club is mostly expats, but their projects now include bomberos. We're bringing fire trucks from California down. We have very insufficient fire protection. We're building eco houses out of tires and bottles, and we're going to do microfinance. And with any luck, Thursday, we're going to have a distanced concert outside on some property where you can sit in your car or you can sit with a mask at a table and chairs, but we'll have a concert and food, some speakers, and we plan to raise enough money to get to our goal of 15,000 so that you, via International, will come down and help us get a program running based on the work you've done and some of the work we've done in other Latin countries. We're very excited, and the community has rallied around like you cannot imagine.
That's wonderful. And when you say we and the community, you're referring to Mujeres para Mujeres, or the broader Rosarito community, or?
The Rosarito community, the Rotary communities, the
Yeah.
Mujeres para Mujeres, the neighbors.
Yeah.
It's quite stunning, actually. Other businesses, other tiny, small businesses, everyone's doing whatever they can. I mean, we've said for years in coffee, every bean counts. Well, now every penny counts.
Yeah. And so, Karen, where would people, if people wanted to go one place to get connected to this network, is there a social media, a Facebook page, or a social media?
Facebook for Mujeres para Mujeres is probably the simplest way to find out.
Yeah, and you find out, see some of those relationships and those networks that are developing. Yeah.
Yep.
And the Vida Nova Coffee.
And the Vida Nova Coffee.
Oh, I have a Vida, a Facebook page as well, Vida Nova Coffee. Thank you.
And so with $15,000, Elisa, the VIA model would be to take that $15,000 and do what? How does that work?
We would be contracting with a new outreach promotora. Actually, we have one in mind who is not new, but who would take on that responsibility and at least have enough funding for that person for, setting up the programming and getting there and those minimal expenses to get it going for a year. And then the balance of the funds will go for capital that will be used for the loans. And it's an incremental process. I mean, you don't start up with 10 groups at once. You start up with one group and they have a whole process of training and education. Most likely we'll do nutrition education as a startup.
Yeah.
And then out of that would emerge the number that may want to start a what we call a solidarity group, which would then, they in solidarity hold the loan.
Yes.
So, and the minimum size group is 5. So most of our groups in Tijuana and Mexicali are between 5 and 10 members.
Yeah.
The small businesses are all their unique ideas, but it is true that in a group, I mean, if John, you told me you wanted to start making tamales, I probably wouldn't give you a loan.
Yeah.
Because I would know that you wouldn't be very good at it.
Well, that's right. Yeah, believe me. Yes.
And so, in those groups, that's exactly how it works, is
Sure.
they, in solidarity, agree to take on the loan of the community.
Yeah.
And to take it one step further, John, we have a very clear intention that we can use this as a model for peace.
Yeah.
Not just minimizing domestic violence in the household, not just putting more food on the table or getting a kid into school, but really talk about borders doing good work together. It's nonsense that we don't have better relationships on the biggest border in the world.
Yes.
It's enough. It's
Yeah.
just enough.
It really is, especially the grupos solidarios, the solidarity group model really is about relationship and building community, and then the solidarity of the financiers, so to speak, right? Where the money is coming from. There is a kind of a relational quality throughout, as I'm learning about it.
Well, and I think just one last thing to relate to what Karen is saying about the peace aspect of this is that I think, if you look at all these pieces, here we have a Rotary group, primarily North Americans living in Baja California. We have the Mujeres para Mujeres, who are primarily retired American women, North American women. And they are interested in supporting that local community where they now reside. This is their local community now, and they want to support that and help that. Yeah. And so, what an expression it is of sort of peace and solidarity, having that support. And to sort of bring it around, I mean, I think that our help or our hope for the Build the Park initiative, I think there are connections to be made about, what's possible here through a lot of built on solidarity of how people can more easily cross borders.
Thanks so much. I'm gonna close with one question for our stream that we'll post to Facebook and YouTube, and then I want to follow up on one conversation that's happening in the chat room just amongst us on the Zoom call. But to finish up our public portion of the program, I do want to ask each of you to just address a question that's been implicit in some of what's been said and explicit a few times about the question of violence in Mexico. Because when I tell people from other parts of the country, the United States especially, that I work on the border or I cross the border regularly or anything like that, the most common question without any close comparison is, oh my gosh, isn't it violent? So how do each of you think about that, residing in Mexico or living and working on both sides of the border? How do you think of that? What do you think about, is it safe to live in Mexico? What's it like to be in a country that is known for violence and or experiences sometimes violence?
I don't want to minimize the violence, but what I do want to say is I've worked in Colombia, Nicaragua, we've worked in Haiti, and trust me, Baja is no worse than any other location. And I want to share a comment that was made by Michael Bruckner. He runs the Jackie Robinson Y here in Southeast San Diego. I was in his Rotary Club when I was living on this side, and he's a very well-respected individual. And one day we were talking about a similar concept at Rotary, the big club, the 550-person club. And he stood up and he said, I want to know how many of you in this room have heard that this year alone, we've had 38 murders in my neighborhood.
Yes.
Nobody knows what's really going on. There's so many good things happening in Mexico. And believe me, if we get these things up and off the ground, we're going to start promoting the good news, not just the bad news.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. Elisa, what are your thoughts? I know you'll have answered that question 1,000 times, but how do you speak about that when people inquire about violence in Mexico or safety in Mexico?
I mean, sometimes, and certainly with our visiting groups that come, and we refer to, sort of as Karen has done, to other cities of comparable size in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at Chicago,
sure.
I mean, the murder rate in Chicago is, I believe, at certain years, higher than the rates in Mexico. I think that, I also think that, this idea that, and this is where it is true that if you know the language or you have familiarity with certain areas of the city or whatever, but you wouldn't maybe in Chicago go to a downtown community that's known for drug trafficking or something. I mean,
without somebody who knows the neighborhood and can show you around
and so I think some of it is maybe allying yourself with people that would be knowing of where to go and kind of what's safe to do and then go forward, because we don't want to be living in fear. We want to be living in in friendship and care for humanity, you know, and that little 1% or whatever it is that are kind of ill-willed just shouldn't rule the day, I think.
Thanks for that. Thank you for that. Well, let me thank you both. And as we sign off from this edition of Las Noticias from the Border, I just again want to give a shout out and thank you to all of our sponsors, all the supporters, and to let you know that next week, October 13th, our guest will be Andy Carey of the Border Philanthropy Partnership and Josephine Talamantes of the Chicano Park Museum. So I'm looking forward to chatting with them about arts and philanthropy and culture, things that they're keeping them busy, and to learn how they're doing through this crazy time of COVID. We're going to continue the conversation here on Zoom, and if any of you who are watching on Facebook or YouTube would like to join our Zoom sessions for a little bit more inside the tent conversation, please just drop us a line at Via International or Via Cafe. It's viainternational.org, viacafe.org. Drop us a line and we'll add you to our mailing list. We're trying here on Tuesdays to look at the news, what's happening in the news from the perspective of the US-Mexico border, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Yeah. And then let me, before we say farewell to everybody, let me just lift up one conversation that's happening here in the chat room, which I'm interested to get your take on. The analogy, I'll summarize, and forgive me, Dan, Mary, Jim, some of you who are chatting, feel free to chime in. The analogy has been drawn about U.S. folks moving to Tijuana as analogous to gentrification in the United States, where property prices rise, cost of living increases, and folks who are residents of Mexico face all the attendant challenges, just as do folks living in urban neighborhoods that are gentrified. And how do you all think about that? Is there a way to live in Mexico that is in solidarity, not just displacing of Mexican nationals and folks earning incomes on a Mexican scale?
Well, I guess I would say a couple of things. One is that in this particular region, I think that one of the reasons that a lot of people that are now residing in Mexico don't bother with visas and all is because their income is coming from the United States. They're retired. They're not taking a job from, from a Mexican person. What is true is that it creates kind of a dual economy. Mm-hmm. I've seen it extremely in the country of Costa Rica. You can go to Costa Rica. If you hang around with Americans, things are one price. If you say you're a Tico, they're another price. So it's very even more alarming, I think, than the distinction, in Mexico. But the other thing I wanted to say, and this is, of course, an arena that we're in a certain regard with our service groups, is the industry of tourism, which of course is the largest industry in the world if you put all the attendant pieces to it together with, airlines, hotels, travel, all of that.
That's exploding.
Yeah. And so if you think about it, also creates these the opportunities. Yeah. And I was thinking specifically, there's a town that in the center of Mexico where we take students called Mineral de Pozos. And it was a ghost town. And now they believe that it will be the next San Miguel de Allende, where they have all these Americans living. It's a beautiful old mining town with a lot of old historic ruins. But if the tourism industry hadn't developed anything there, it would be a true ghost town. Yeah. Because there would just be nothing left there that could create some economy.
Yeah, let's see, it was I think it was Dan Watman and Andrea Rocha, Jim Gerber. If any of you would like to elaborate or interject, you're welcome to do so. Did I summarize the conversation? I know you.
I see there's a question about crossing.
Yeah.
It's never the same way twice, but one thing COVID has done is really eliminated the traffic. So it's very easy to cross generally both ways. And usually there's just very few people entering Mexico.
Yeah. I'm interested, Karen, you mentioned that you think of coffee as kind of like an analogous to oil and,
Second biggest traded commodity in the world. Coffee is the second biggest after oil.
So that makes me think
Legal.
of, and this tourism question, and again, this idea, or the idea of, you know, those are sometimes called extractive, right, industries, right? Because from a capitalist, you know, from the business perspective, you're simply extracting the commodity, right? From, and so but the idea of, you know, how do you work in a way that's not purely extractive, right? Or how do you travel in a way that is not purely extractive, where you're simply extracting from the local economy, you know, the beauty, the food, and leaving nothing in your wake, right? So I think
Start microcredit programs.
yeah, exactly.
And
Well,
you pay the right price for the product.
there you
You
go.
don't pay peanuts, pennies for coffee.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And so there's
You
that.
have to pay the fair price.
Yeah, there is a kind of philosophy. I know it doesn't resolve all of these issues of inequality, privilege, you know, that so many of us live with as part of our daily lives. But there is a way, I do think, I like to think of engaging in Mexico, for instance, in a way that is less, is something other than purely extractive, right? It's,
The specialty industry is really moving towards relationship coffees.
Yeah.
And they're building platforms so that someday while you're having your cup of coffee, you'll be able to call up that farmer and say,
yeah,
hi there, I just roasted and brewed and
yeah,
I'm serving myself. Tell me about your farm.
yeah.
That's the future of
Yeah.
coffee.
Yeah, and that relationality and building relationships is a big part of what we're trying to accomplish through our Via Cafe, for instance. So thank you for that, Karen.
I think
Let's see.
one other, I
Yeah.
had an opportunity here to read in the chat a little bit. And
Yeah.
I did want to say something to Daniel's question or Daniel's comment about the kind of dual economy that exists. And I think it is important to recognize that in the last decade, that Mexico has definitely formalized many of the legal procedures for, you know, the difference of you're not supposed to be in Mexico and charge things in dollars, including rent. I mean, in our little nonprofit that in Los Niños in Tijuana, I mean, we specifically are paying our rent in peso terms to be correct, to have a factura, an invoice for our rent and to pay it in a correct fashion. And one of the factors of the border region is that many of the owners of real estate are some Mexican nationals, some North Americans, and they live in the United States. And so they want to be paid in dollars.
Yeah.
And so they're going to charge in dollars. And then when the peso falls, you know, a Mexican person that's making pesos is at great risk, you know? So I think that there are these inequities that happen due to the border. I mean, due to where we're located. It was interesting that a friend I was speaking with in Mexico City the other day, and she was saying, you know, we don't accept dollars down here on the street.
Yeah.
You have to go change them to pesos. We're not going to, you know, let you walk around with dollars and take them. So, you know, it's a really, economically, it's a really unique situation that we have at the border.
Yeah. Well, listen, Lisa, Karen, thanks so much. This was fun. And I want to say thank you again to all the folks who have joined us. Thanks for tuning in. Drop us a line if you need to be on the list. Otherwise, we'll look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. We'll continue to talk. I'll continue to just raise the question of politics. Just FYI, I want to alert people to this simply because it's so much in the news. And Karen's observation is entirely appropriate. If it's your preference not to talk politics, don't worry, I'm not going to jam it down your throat. But I'm feeling myself, just feeling so stressed by it and so preoccupied by it. And it's just dumb, you know.
Come to Mexico.
There you go. There you go. And I haven't been able to cross the border nearly enough lately. It is, I'm missing that. That's definitely a downside to the COVID for me, is that I've been holed up here at home and probably reading too much news, right? Or too much American news, too much headlines produced out of Washington, manufactured out of Washington, D.C., right, by design. So, but anyway, we'll continue to, and especially because there are a couple of Tuesdays coming up, like Election Day, and the day after, where I have some really interesting guests, where we'll probably talk U.S. politics just again, because that's very much in the news, but that's not the theme of this whole series. So I didn't want to scare you all off by talking too much politics. So, but very good. Thanks so much for joining. Peace to you, and we'll see you next Tuesday for Andy Carey and Josephine Talamantes. So thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Jess. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Más unidos que